Before I begin, if you've ever lived through a moment where the truth changed how you saw someone you loved, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I used to think I knew the sound of my house the way a mother knows her own heartbeat. The refrigerator's low hum at night, the floorboard that creaked near the hallway bathroom, the particular silence that meant my son was asleep versus the heavier one that meant he was awake and thinking. That winter, though, the house had learned a new silence. It followed my son like a shadow, settling into rooms after he left them, lingering long after he shut his bedroom door. My son Caleb was 16 then, tall in that awkward way where his limbs seemed to belong to someone older, his voice half settled into manhood, his eyes still soft with boyhood. He'd always been talkative, not in a non-stop way, but in bursts, stories from school, opinions about music, sudden philosophical questions that came out of nowhere while we were doing dishes. So when he started answering me with one-word replies, I noticed. When he stopped leaving his door open, I noticed. When he started checking his phone like it was a lifeline, I noticed that too. I told myself it was normal. Teenagers pull away. Every parenting book says that. But intuition is a stubborn thing. It taps you on the shoulder even when you're busy pretending not to feel it. The name Eli came up one night at dinner, almost by accident. I asked who he was texting so intently, and Caleb said, "Just a friend." The way he said it, too fast, too careful, made the word just feel wrong. Not dangerous, just incomplete. "From school?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, the way mothers learn to do when we don't want to spook the truth into hiding. "Yeah," he said. Then he pushed his food around his plate like it had offended him. I didn't press. I wish I could say that was wisdom. It wasn't. It was fear. Fear of becoming the kind of parent who interrogates instead of listens. Fear of opening a door I wasn't sure I knew how to walk through. Over the next few weeks, Eli became a quiet presence in our lives. A ride home here, a late-night call there. Caleb would say, "I'm going to study with Eli," or "Eli needs help with math," or "Eli's having a rough day." Always said with that careful tone, like he was handling something fragile. Sometimes he'd smile when he said the name. Other times his face would tighten and he'd go quiet afterward, retreating into his room with the lights off. One evening I knocked on his door and didn't wait for permission. I found him sitting on his bed, phone in his hands, eyes red like he'd been rubbing them too hard. "You okay?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just tired." I sat beside him anyway. The bed dipped under my weight, and for a moment he leaned into me without realizing it. When he caught himself, he straightened, embarrassed. I wanted to say 100 things, that he could tell me anything, that I was on his side, that whatever it was, we could handle it together. Instead, I said the wrong thing. "Is this about that friend of yours?" I asked. He froze, completely still, like a deer sensing danger. "It's nothing," he said, too quickly. And there it was, that line parents hear when it's absolutely something. That night, after he went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done. I replayed every interaction, every look, every half-finished sentence. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but my mind jumped anyway. Drugs, trouble at school, a girl, depression, the usual fears lined up, waiting their turn. I didn't consider that the truth might be something I wasn't afraid of, but something I didn't yet understand. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. It was raining, the kind of steady rain that turns streetlights into blurs and makes the world feel smaller. Caleb came home late, later than usual. When he walked through the door, his jacket soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, he looked like he'd been holding his breath for miles. "Where have you been?" I asked. I tried to keep the edge out of my voice. It slipped in anyway. He didn't answer right away. He set his bag down carefully, like it might shatter if he moved too fast. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "We need to talk." Those 5 words can turn your stomach inside out. We need to talk. Every parent knows the weight of them. I followed him into the living room. He didn't sit, he paced, rubbing his hands together, then running them through his hair. Finally, he stopped in front of me, eyes fixed on the floor. "You remember Eli?" I nodded. My heart was already racing. "He's not just a friend," Caleb said. There it was, the sentence I'd been bracing for without knowing it. I waited. I forced myself not to interrupt, not to fill the silence with assumptions. Caleb swallowed hard. "He's been staying at the bus station some nights." The words didn't land the way I expected. They floated there, confusing, incomplete. "The bus station?" I repeated. "He doesn't have a place to go," Caleb said. "His mom kicked him out." My first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then fear, all tumbling over each other. "Kicked him out? Why? How did you know? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" But beneath all of that was something quieter, a realization that my son had been carrying a weight far heavier than teenage secrecy. "Why?" I asked, softly. Caleb finally looked up at me. His eyes were wet, shining with unshed tears. "Because she found out," he said. "Found out what?" He took a breath so deep it shook his shoulders. "That Eli is gay." The room seemed to tilt, not because of what he said, but because of everything it suddenly explained. The secrecy, the late nights, the careful way Caleb talked about him, the protectiveness I'd mistaken for trouble. "And," Caleb continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "because so am I." In that moment, time didn't stop. It stretched, it expanded to hold 1,000 thoughts at once. My own childhood lessons, my fears about the world, the way love can be conditional in places it should never be, and the boy standing in front of me, waiting to see if I would become another door slamming shut. I didn't say anything right away. I stood up and wrapped my arms around him before my mind could interfere. He stiffened at first, then collapsed into me, sobbing in a way I hadn't heard since he was little. "I didn't want you to be disappointed," he said into my shoulder. "I didn't want you to think I was wrong." I held him tighter. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, "there is nothing wrong with you." But even as I said it, another truth was rising in my chest. Loving him wasn't the hard part. The hard part was realizing how much he'd been protecting someone else while carrying his own fear alone, and how little I'd seen it. That night, he told me everything. How Eli's mother had found messages on his phone, how she'd screamed, called him names no child should hear, and told him not to come back. How Caleb had started sneaking him food, lending him hoodies, sitting with him in the cold just so he wouldn't be alone. How he'd lied to me not because he didn't trust me, but because he was afraid of losing the only safe place he had left. By the time he finished, my heart felt bruised, not just for my son, but for a boy I hadn't met, sleeping somewhere he shouldn't have to be. And I realized the truth about his friend wasn't just about who Caleb loved, it was about who he was becoming, someone brave, someone compassionate, someone willing to stand in the rain for another person even when it scared him. As he went to bed that night, exhausted but lighter, I stayed on the couch, staring at the darkened hallway. I knew our lives had shifted. I knew challenges were coming, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that the next choice I made as a mother would matter more than anything I'd ever done before. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caleb's face when he said the words out loud, like he was stepping off a cliff and hoping I'd be there to catch him. I kept replaying my reaction, checking it over and over in my mind, making sure there hadn't been even a flicker of hesitation that he might have noticed. Parents don't get many moments like that, moments where a single breath can decide whether your child feels safe or alone. I was grateful I'd chosen instinct over fear. Morning came quietly. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean, like it was pretending nothing had changed. Caleb slept in, worn out from crying and confessing and finally exhaling after months of holding everything in. I made coffee and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug, thinking about Eli, a boy I hadn't met, a boy who had been erased from his own home with one cruel discovery. When Caleb finally came out of his room, his eyes were puffy, his movements cautious. He watched me the way you watch someone when you're not sure if the ground beneath you is solid yet. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "Morning," he replied. I slid a plate of toast toward him. "You hungry?" He nodded, then paused. "Mom, about last night." I meant what I said before he could finish, all of it. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Okay. We ate in a fragile quiet. Not awkward, just new. After a few minutes, he cleared his throat. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always. Are you mad I didn't tell you sooner?" The question landed heavier than he intended. I thought about it honestly before answering. "I'm sad you felt like you couldn't, but I'm not mad. You were trying to protect yourself and someone else." He nodded slowly. "Eli didn't want anyone to know where he was staying. He's scared social services will get involved or that he'll end up somewhere worse." That word, worse, echoed in my chest. Worse than sleeping at a bus station? Worse than being told your existence was a problem? "Where is he now?" I asked. He hesitated. "Last night, he was at the station again. I stayed with him until it got really cold." I stood up without thinking. "He shouldn't be there," I said, more to myself than Caleb. He looked at me, eyes wide. "Mom, I don't want you to think I'm trying to—" "I know," I interrupted softly. "I know." I paced the kitchen, my thoughts racing ahead of my caution. There are moments when you feel a decision forming before you fully examined it. This was one of those moments. "Does he have anywhere else to go?" I asked. Caleb shook his head. "No." I stopped pacing. I looked at my son, really looked at him, the same boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the same boy who once cried for days when a stray cat disappeared from our yard. "Does Eli know you told me?" I asked. "No," he said quickly. "I didn't want to betray his trust." "You didn't. You trusted me with something important." He swallowed. "What are we going to do?" "We." The word mattered. I took a deep breath. "We're going to make sure he's safe, for now." Caleb stared at me. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said carefully, "that if Eli is willing, he can come here, just for a little while, until we figure out next steps." His eyes filled instantly. "Are you serious?" "Yes." "But what if people find out? What if his mom—" "We'll handle that, one thing at a time." He came around the table and hugged me so tightly it stole my breath. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have no idea what this means." I did have an idea, and it scared me, and I did it anyway. Eli arrived that afternoon with a backpack that looked too light to carry a life. He stood on our porch like he was waiting to be told he'd made a mistake. He was smaller than Caleb, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting around like he expected to be chased away. "Hi," I said, opening the door wider. "I'm Caleb's mom." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." I said, "You can call me Maria. Come in, you must be cold." He stepped inside slowly, like he was crossing a line he wasn't sure he was allowed to cross. Caleb hovered beside him, protective without being obvious. We sat in the living room. Eli kept his hands folded in his lap, answering questions politely but briefly. He apologized 3 times for being a bother. Each apology felt like a bruise on my heart. "You're not a bother," I told him. "You're a guest." He blinked at me like he wasn't familiar with the word in that context. That first night, he ate 2 bowls of soup and still apologized for being hungry. When I showed him the guest room, he stood in the doorway staring at the bed like it might disappear. "I can sleep on the floor," he said quickly. "You will sleep on the bed," I said gently. "That's what beds are for." He nodded, his jaw tight, eyes glossy. After he closed the door, Caleb leaned against the hallway wall, his face a mix of relief and fear. "Is this okay?" he asked. "It is," I said, "but it won't be easy." The days that followed were a strange blend of normalcy and tension. Eli showered like it was a privilege. He flinched at raised voices on television. He kept his phone off most of the time, afraid his mother would somehow track him down through it. At night, I heard him pacing quietly in the guest room. I called a lawyer friend, a counselor. I read everything I could about emergency housing, about parental rejection, about the long shadow it casts. Each article felt personal, urgent. One evening, about a week in, I found Eli sitting at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. He was staring at his phone, tears sliding silently down his face. "Eli," I said softly. He jumped. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Come here," I said, pulling out a chair. He hesitated, then sat. "She texted me," he said, his voice flat. I didn't ask what it said. I didn't need to. "I keep thinking maybe if I say the right thing she'll let me come home, but I don't think she wants me anymore." There it was, the wound beneath all the politeness. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "parents fail the people they're supposed to love the most. That doesn't mean the child did anything wrong." He wiped his face with his sleeve. "I just want her to look at me the way she used to." I reached across the table and covered his hand. He stiffened, then relaxed. "I can't fix that," I said honestly, "but while you're here, you are wanted. You are safe." He nodded, biting his lip like he was trying not to fall apart. That night, as I turned off the lights, I realized something important. This wasn't just about shelter. It was about showing 2 boys, one my son, one not, that love doesn't evaporate when truth enters the room. It expands, or it withers, and every adult gets to choose which. I didn't know yet how complicated things were about to become. I didn't know how Eli's mother would respond, or how the school would react, or how the world outside our front door might push back. All I knew was that the truth my son told me had already changed the shape of our family, and there was no going back. By the second week, our house had developed a new rhythm. It wasn't smooth yet, but it was steady. Eli learned which cabinet held the cereal. Caleb stopped hovering quite so closely, trusting that Eli wouldn't disappear the moment he turned his back. And I learned how loudly silence can speak when someone is afraid to take up space. School was the first real test. I dreaded it more than I wanted to admit. Teenagers can be cruel without meaning to be, and adults can be cruel while convincing themselves they're being responsible. When I called the school counselor to explain that Eli was temporarily staying with us, there was a pause on the line that lasted just a little too long. "Is he homeless?" she asked finally. "He's displaced," I replied, choosing my word carefully. Another pause. "We'll need to discuss guardianship and liability." I hung up, feeling like I'd just stepped into deep water without checking the temperature. That evening, I explained everything to Eli and Caleb. I told them there would be meetings, paperwork, uncomfortable questions. I watched Eli's shoulders slowly creep up toward his ears as I spoke. "I don't want to cause problems," he said. "You're not," I said firmly. "Adults just like to label things so they can feel in control." Caleb squeezed his hand under the table, and I pretended not to notice. Some gestures don't need commentary. The counselor meeting was exactly as stiff as I'd feared. There were clipped smiles and polite concern, but underneath it all was suspicion. Where was Eli's mother? Why hadn't she filed a missing person report? How long was this arrangement expected to last? When I explained why he'd been kicked out, one of the administrators cleared his throat and said, "These situations can be complicated." "No," I said calmly, "they're painful. Adults make them complicated when they refuse to face that." Eli sat beside me, eyes on his shoes, shrinking with every word spoken over his head. When it was over, he thanked everyone quietly, like he was grateful for just being tolerated. On the drive home, he stared out the window. "I'm sorry you have to deal with this," he said. I pulled the car over, right there on the side of the road. "Eli," I said, turning to face him fully, "you are not a burden. Not here, not anywhere. Do you understand me?" He nodded, but his eyes said he wasn't sure he believed it yet. That belief was tested a few days later when his mother finally called me. Her voice was tight, clipped, like every word hurt to say. She accused me of kidnapping, of encouraging rebellion, of corrupting her son. "He's confused, and you're enabling it." I felt anger rise hot and fast, but I kept my voice steady. "He's a child who needed safety," I said, "and he still does." There was silence on the line. Then, colder than before, "He's not welcome in my home until he fixes this." I hung up shaking, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew how final that sounded. I told Eli later that evening, "I tried to soften it. There's no soft way to hear your parent has chosen belief over you." He didn't cry. He just nodded, like a door had closed somewhere deep inside him. That night, I found Caleb sitting on his bed, fists clenched. "I hate her," he said. "How can you do that to your own kid?" I sat beside him. Sometimes people love an idea of who their child should be more than who they are. Caleb swallowed. "Will you ever stop loving me?" The question sliced straight through me. "Never," I said, without hesitation. "There is nothing you could be that would make me stop." He leaned his head on my shoulder, and for the first time since all this began, he cried. Weeks passed. Winter softened into early spring. Eli started smiling more, cautiously at first, then with real warmth. He joined the debate club. He laughed at Caleb's dumb jokes. He helped me cook dinner and asked permission before everything, like he was afraid of stepping on an invisible rule. One evening, as we were washing dishes, he said quietly, "I've never seen a family talk like this." "Like what?" I asked. "Like people matter," he said. I had to turn away so he wouldn't see my face. The paperwork moved slowly, but progress was made. Temporary guardianship, counseling referrals, resources I hadn't known existed until we needed them. The world didn't suddenly become kind, but it became navigable. Then came the night that tested everything we'd built. Caleb came home later than usual, eyes bright, breath fast. "Mom," he said, barely containing himself, "Eli's mom came to the school." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "She wanted to see him," he said. "She said she might be ready to talk." Hope is a dangerous thing. It can lift you or drop you from a great height. Eli sat on the couch, knees bouncing, hands twisting in his lap. "What if she just wants to tell me I'm wrong again?" he asked. "Then you won't face it alone," I said. The meeting happened 2 days later in a counselor's office that smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Eli's mother didn't look like a villain. She looked tired, afraid, stuck inside beliefs she didn't know how to let go of. She cried. She apologized for overreacting. She didn't apologize for the words she said or the nights he'd spent cold and scared. Eli listened quietly. When she finished, he said, "I love you, but I can't come back if you can't accept me." The room held its breath. She didn't answer. When it was over, Eli walked out with his head high. He looked older somehow, stronger. On the drive home, he said, "I think I'm going to be okay, even if she never changes." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You already are." That night, as I watched both boys laugh over a video game, I understood something I hadn't before. The truth my son had told me wasn't a single revelation. It was an invitation to choose empathy over fear, to build a family not just by blood, but by courage. And I knew the final lesson hadn't come yet, but it was close. The weeks after that meeting felt quieter on the surface, but underneath, everything was shifting. Eli's mother stopped calling, not out of anger this time, but avoidance. The counselor explained it gently, saying some parents retreat when faced with truths they're not ready to carry. Eli nodded like he understood, but grief doesn't always need explanation to hurt. What surprised me most was how Caleb changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in subtle ways. He stood straighter. He spoke with more certainty. The boy who once tried to disappear into humor now chose his words carefully, like he knew they mattered. One afternoon, as we drove home from the grocery store, he said, "I don't think I'm as scared anymore." "Of what?" I asked. "Of being seen," he replied. That sentence stayed with me. I realized then that parenting a teenager isn't about guiding them forward so much as stepping aside and letting them emerge. Spring brought school events, obligations, the kind of normal chaos that had felt so distant months earlier. Eli was invited to a friend's birthday party, his first. He asked me 3 times if it was really okay to go. "You're allowed to be a kid," I told him. He smiled in a way that was all disbelief and hope. The real storm came unexpectedly on an ordinary Tuesday. I was folding laundry when my phone rang. It was the school principal. "There's been an incident," she said carefully. "It involves Caleb and Eli." My heart dropped straight to my feet. By the time I arrived, both boys were sitting in the office, shoulders tight, eyes blazing. A group of students had cornered them near the gym. Words were said, slurs. Someone had pushed Eli. Caleb had swung back. I listened as the story unfolded, anger simmering beneath my calm. When the principal suggested mutual responsibility, something in me snapped. "My son defended someone who was being attacked," I said. "If that's a problem, then we need to talk about what kind of lesson this school is teaching." Eli looked at me like he'd never seen an adult do that before. The school assigned detentions, counseling sessions, statements. As we walked out, Caleb kicked at the pavement. "I didn't mean to make things worse," he said. "You didn't. You chose not to be silent." That night, Eli sat on his bed staring at the wall. "This is why people hide," he said quietly. I sat beside him. "And this is why some people stand." A few days later, something unexpected happened. A parent from the school reached out, then another. Quiet messages of support, stories shared in hushed tones about siblings, cousins, children who hadn't been protected in time. One mother hugged me in the parking lot, tears in her eyes, and said, "Thank you for being brave when it's easier to look away." I realized then that courage is contagious. The boys' story spread, not in a gossip way, but in a human one. Teachers became more attentive. A student group formed. Eli was asked if he wanted to join. He hesitated, then said yes. One evening, I found them sitting on the porch watching the sun sink low. "Do you ever wish things were different?" Eli asked. Caleb thought for a moment. "I wish you hadn't been hurt," he said, "but I don't wish you were someone else." Eli smiled, really smiled. "Me neither." That summer, we took a short trip to the lake. Nothing fancy, just water, sun, and a break from watching our backs. Eli learned how to skip stones. Caleb tried and failed and laughed until he fell over. I watched them from the shore, my heart full and aching at the same time. One night by the campfire, Eli said softly, "I think this is the first time I've felt normal in a long time." I stared into the flames. Normal is overrated. Safe is better. He nodded. As summer edged toward its end, the question we'd been avoiding finally came up. College brochures were arriving, plans were forming, and with them the reality that Eli couldn't stay in limbo forever. "What happens when I turn 18?" he asked one evening. I took a breath. "We'll talk about options and choices." He looked at me carefully. "You don't have to keep helping me." "I know, but I want to." Caleb reached for his hand. They sat there, two boys who had found each other in the middle of chaos, building something steady out of uncertainty. Later that night, alone in my room, I allowed myself to feel the fear I'd been holding back. Fear of legal complications, of judgment, of the day Eli might leave carrying both gratitude and scars. But beneath that fear was something stronger, pride. Not just in my son, but in the kind of home we'd become. I understood now that the truth Caleb told me months earlier wasn't a single moment of honesty. It was the beginning of a long, imperfect act of love, one that asked me to grow alongside my child, not ahead of him. And as summer faded, I sensed the final chapter approaching, not an ending, but a turning point that would ask one last thing of all of us. By the time fall arrived, the air felt sharper, like it was clearing space for something new. Leaves gathered along the sidewalks, and with them came decisions we could no longer postpone. Eli was 17 and a half now, close enough to adulthood that every form, every plan carried weight. He tried not to show it, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on clocks, calendars, milestones he wasn't sure he was allowed to claim. One evening, as I was sorting mail, I found a letter addressed to him, a college outreach program offering mentorship and support for students facing housing instability. I set it aside, unsure how to bring it up without making him feel like a problem to be solved. He noticed it anyway. "That's for me," he said, his voice cautious. "Yes," I replied. "You don't have to open it now." He sat down and did anyway. As he read, his shoulders slowly relaxed. "They think I could actually go," he said, not excited, just stunned. "You could," I said. "You already are." That night, the three of us talked long after dinner about money, about scholarships, about what family means when it isn't written neatly on a birth certificate. Caleb listened more than he spoke, his hand resting casually near Eli's, a quiet promise of presence. A week later, Eli's mother called again. This time, her voice was different, not angry, not defensive, just empty. "I heard he's doing well," she said. "He is," I answered. She hesitated. "I don't know how to fix this." I closed my eyes. Sometimes fixing isn't the first step. Listening is. She didn't respond, but when the call ended, I felt something shift. Not resolution, but movement. The next test came in the form of a legal letter, custody questions, deadlines, language that felt cold and heavy. I spent a night at the kitchen table, papers spread out, heart pounding. This was the part no one prepares you for, the moment when love demands paperwork. Caleb found me there, eyes sleepy. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I smiled weakly. "It will be." He sat down across from me. "You know," he said, "I used to think being a good person meant not making waves. And now? Now I think it means being willing to." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You've taught me more than you know." The hearing was brief, clinical. The judge spoke about best interests, temporary arrangements, next steps. Eli answered questions with quiet honesty. When it was over, he exhaled like he'd been underwater. Outside the courthouse, he looked at me. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "You didn't give up on yourself. I just stood nearby." Life settled again, not into ease, but into something workable. Eli applied for programs. Caleb focused on his own future, his confidence growing alongside his plans. Our home felt fuller, louder, warmer than it ever had. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Eli said, "I used to think family was something you either had or didn't." I looked at him. "And now?" He said, "Now I think it's something you build." That was the moment I knew he was going to be okay. The truth my son told me months ago had arrived disguised as fear, but what it revealed was resilience, connection, and the quiet power of choosing love when it's inconvenient. I didn't know what the future would hold. None of us did. But as I watched the boys laugh in the living room, planning a life that once felt impossible, I understood the lesson that would stay with me forever. When your child trusts you with the truth, they are handing you more than information. They are handing you their heart. And what you do next becomes the story they tell themselves about love for the rest of their life. By late October, the house smelled like cinnamon and old books, the kind of scent that settles in when routines finally stick. Eli had been with us long enough that his presence no longer felt temporary, even though we all knew nothing about his situation was permanent yet. He'd stopped apologizing every time he opened the fridge. He'd started humming while he did homework. Small things, but they mattered. Caleb, on the other hand, was learning what it meant to be visible in a world that doesn't always reward honesty. The incident at school had followed him longer than we expected. Whispers, side glances, a teacher who suddenly spoke to him with forced neutrality. One afternoon, he came home quieter than usual, his backpack hitting the floor with a dull thud. "What happened?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing." But nothing doesn't make a kid's shoulders sag like that. Later that night, he knocked on my bedroom door. "Can I ask you something kind of stupid?" "There are no stupid questions," I said, sitting up. "Do you ever wish I were easier?" he asked, "like less complicated?" The question broke my heart in a way I wasn't prepared for. "No," I said immediately. "I wish the world were kinder to people who are honest." He nodded, eyes glossy. "Sometimes I feel like I made things harder for you." I reached for his hand. "I made things truer," I said, "and truth always asks something of us." That weekend, Eli had his first therapy appointment. He was nervous in a quiet way, his jaw clenched, his answers rehearsed. When he came home, he sat on the couch and stared at the wall for a long time. "How was it?" I asked gently. He thought before answering. "Hard," he said, "but good. I didn't know I was allowed to be angry." "You are," I said. "Anger can be a doorway, as long as you don't live there." He nodded, absorbing it like everything else. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Eli's mother showed up at the house. I saw her car first, parked awkwardly at the curb like it wasn't sure it belonged there. My stomach tightened as I opened the door. She stood on the porch, hands clasped, eyes rimmed red. "I just want to see him, if he wants to see me." I didn't answer right away. I called Eli down and told him she was here. I made sure my voice carried no expectation. He stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, then slowly came down. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. "I can't stay long, and I need you to listen." She nodded, tears spilling freely now. "I'll try." They talked on the porch. I stayed inside, close enough to intervene, far enough to give them space. I heard fragments, apologies tangled with justifications, love tangled with fear. When Eli finally came back inside, his face was pale but calm. "She's not ready, but I think she might be someday." "That's more than nothing," I replied. He looked at me. "Thank you for not making me choose." That sentence settled deep in my chest. Parenting, I was learning, is often about refusing false choices. As winter approached, the boys started talking about the future with cautious excitement. Caleb mentioned colleges farther away. Eli talked about independence programs, shared housing, steps towards standing on his own. One night, after they'd both gone to bed, I stood in the hallway and listened to the house. It no longer sounded tense. It sounded alive. I thought back to the moment Caleb had stood in the living room, terrified, telling me the truth about his friend. How easily that moment could have gone differently, how a single reaction could have changed the trajectory of 3 lives. I realized then that the story wasn't about shock or betrayal at all. It was about what happens when a child risks honesty and finds safety on the other side. And I knew the final part of this story wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet, earned, the kind of ending that feels like a beginning. Winter arrived gently, without the drama I'd braced myself for. Snow dusted the rooftops like an afterthought, and the cold seemed less hostile than it once had. By then, Eli had been with us long enough that his toothbrush sat beside Caleb's without question, his jacket hung among ours, his name spoken in future tense sentences as naturally as the present. But comfort doesn't erase complexity, it just gives it room to surface. Eli turned 18 in January. We marked it quietly with a homemade cake and a single candle. He stared at the flame longer than necessary before blowing it out. "Does it feel different?" Caleb asked. Eli shrugged. "I feel the same, just more responsible." That night, after everyone went to bed, Eli knocked on my door. "I don't want to mess things up now that I'm technically an adult. I don't want to overstay." I sat on the edge of the bed and motioned for him to sit. "You're not overstaying," I said, "but I hear what you're really asking." He looked down. "I don't want to need you forever." "Needing help doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human." He nodded, but I could see the conflict. Independence had become both his goal and his fear. A week later, he was accepted into the outreach program, partial housing support, counseling, a path forward. He read the email twice, then handed me the phone with shaking hands. "They want me," he said, disbelief lacing every word. I hugged him, careful not to make it feel like obligation. "Of course they do." Caleb watched from the doorway, pride and something like loss flickering across his face. Later that night, he admitted it. "I'm happy for him," he said. "I just don't want things to change too fast." "They will," I said gently, "but not all at once." The move-out date came in early March. Eli packed slowly, like each item carried memory. He left the room clean, the bed made, the window cracked open just a little. Before he left, he stood in the living room, hands in his pockets. "I don't know how to say thank you without it sounding small," he said. "I don't think you have to," I replied. "Just live well." He hugged me, then Caleb, holding on a second longer than necessary. "I'm still family, right?" he asked, half joking. "Always," Caleb said. After he left, the house felt quieter, not empty, just different. Caleb wandered into the guest room that night, stood there a moment, then closed the door softly. Weeks passed, messages came regularly, updates, small victories, setbacks, life unfolding. One afternoon, Caleb came home with a letter, a college acceptance. He read it aloud, voice shaking, joy breaking through every word. "I did it," he said. "You did," I replied, my heart full. As we celebrated, I thought about the journey that had brought us here, about the fear I'd felt that first night, about the courage it took for my son to speak and for me to listen. Eli visited often, less like a guest now, more like a returning piece of the home. His laughter filled the rooms again, even if just for an evening. On one of those visits, as we sat around the table, Eli said, I used to think being loved meant being tolerated. Caleb looked at him. Now? He said, now I know it means being chosen. I realized then that the truth Caleb told me hadn't just changed our lives, it had taught us how to choose each other again and again. And as spring returned, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings, I knew the story was nearing an end, not because love had run out, but because it had found its place. Spring didn't announce itself loudly that year. It arrived in pieces. Longer afternoons, windows cracked open just enough to let fresh air argue with the heat. The quiet confidence that comes when survival gives way to living. By then, our lives had settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than assumed. Caleb was counting down the months until graduation. He pretended not to care, but I saw the way he reread acceptance emails, the way his future no longer felt like a question mark. He talked about dorm rooms and classes with the kind of hope that only comes after fear has loosened its grip. Eli was finding his footing, one careful step at a time. He had his own small apartment now, shared with another student from the program. He worked part-time at a bookstore and sent me photos of handwritten recommendation cards he'd helped customers choose. Every update felt like a quiet victory. One afternoon, he stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, hands full of groceries, smiling like he belonged there, which he did. "I made soup," he said. "I thought you might like some." I laughed. "You never stop trying to contribute, do you?" He smiled shyly. Old habits. As we cooked together, he told me about a customer who thanked him for listening, about a professor who'd noticed his effort, about how strange it felt to be seen without having to explain himself first. "I still get scared sometimes," he admitted, "like it could all disappear." I nodded. That fear doesn't mean you're fragile. It means you remember what it was like to have nothing. He considered that. I think that's why I want to help people. That night, Caleb joined us, and the three of us sat around the table like we had so many times before. Different chapter, same foundation. Later, after Eli left, Caleb lingered in the kitchen. "Do you think I did the right thing?" he asked quietly. "Telling you everything?" I looked at him, really looked at him. Not the child he had been, but the young man he was becoming. "Yes," I said, "you chose honesty over fear. That choice echoes." He nodded. "I don't regret it anymore." That summer, we attended his graduation. Eli sat with us, clapping the loudest, eyes shining. When Caleb crossed the stage, he looked straight at us. I felt something inside me close a long, open loop. After the ceremony, Eli hugged Caleb tightly. "You saved my life," he whispered. Caleb shook his head. "You saved your own. I just didn't look away." I stood there, overwhelmed by the simplicity of it, how one decision, to listen instead of react, had unraveled years of inherited fear. As the crowd dispersed, I realized something else. This story had never been about the shock of a secret. It was about what happens after, the quiet daily choices, the willingness to let love expand instead of contract. Months later, on a calm evening, I sat alone on the porch watching the light fade. I thought about the moment Caleb told me the truth about his friend, how unprepared I felt, how ordinary the room had been, how extraordinary the impact. We don't get to choose the truths our children carry, but we do get to choose how we receive them, with walls or with open arms. That choice changes everything. By the time fall returned again, the kind that smells like sharpened pencils and damp leaves, I realized something quietly profound. I no longer flinched when my phone rang late. I no longer scanned Caleb's face for signs of hiding. The fear that once lived in the corners of my mind had softened into trust. Not blind trust, but the kind built slowly, honestly, through shared truth. Caleb left for college in August. The morning he packed his car, the driveway felt too small for the weight of the moment. He moved with purpose, but his eyes kept drifting back to the house like he was memorizing it. "You're going to do great," I told him, even as my chest ached. He hugged me hard. "You did great," he corrected. "You didn't freak out when it mattered." I laughed through tears. That was mostly panic in disguise. He smiled. "Still, you listened." Eli came by to say goodbye before Caleb left. They stood by the car, talking in low voices, hands brushing, the kind of closeness that doesn't need to be claimed out loud. When Caleb finally got in, Eli stepped back, swallowing hard. "Don't disappear," Caleb said through the open window. "Never," Eli replied. After the car pulled away, Eli and I stood in the driveway for a long moment. "He's going to change the world," Eli said softly. "So are you," I replied. Life grew quieter after that. Not lonely, just spacious. Eli visited often, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to ask advice he already half knew the answer to. He talked about classes, about therapy breakthroughs, about the complicated, tender process of redefining himself without constant fear. One evening, he told me he'd run into his mother at the grocery store. "She asked how I was," he said. "Really asked." I waited. "I told her I was okay," he continued, "and I meant it." He didn't say whether she apologized. He didn't need to. Healing doesn't always come with speeches. Sometimes it comes with boundaries that no longer bleed. As winter settled in, I found myself reflecting more than usual about the kind of parent I thought I'd be, about the one I was still becoming. I realized how close I'd come to missing the most important moment of my life, not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid of caring wrong. When Caleb came home for the holidays, he seemed lighter, more himself. We cooked together, laughed, fell back into old rhythms with new depth. One night, sitting at the table long after dinner, he said, "I don't feel like I'm pretending anymore." "That's a good way to live," I said. Eli joined us the next day. The house filled up again like it knew what to do. Watching the two of them together, older now, steadier, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. Later, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone and thought about the story people imagine when they hear a phrase like, "My teenage son told me the truth about his friend." They imagine scandal, betrayal, shock. What they don't imagine is the quiet aftermath, the dishes washed together, the late-night conversations, the paperwork, the waiting, the choosing over and over to lead with love instead of fear. The truth hadn't broken my family. It had revealed it. And I knew there was one final thing this story needed. Not a twist, not a confrontation, but a reckoning, a moment of clarity that would carry me forward long after the details faded. That moment came sooner than I expected. The moment came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually slips by unnoticed. I was sorting through a box of old photos, deciding what to keep and what to finally let go of. Years compressed into glossy rectangles, birthday candles, school plays, beach days where everyone squinted into the sun, proof of a life that had moved forward whether I was ready or not. At the bottom of the box, I found a picture of Caleb at 13. He was standing in the backyard, holding a half-built kite, looking straight at the camera with an expression I recognized instantly now. Hope, mixed with uncertainty, a boy on the edge of knowing himself, already wondering if the world would let him be who he was becoming. I sat down hard in the chair. It struck me then how close I'd come to failing him without ever meaning to, how easily love can become conditional when it's filtered through fear, tradition, or silence. I realized that the bravest thing Caleb ever did wasn't defending Eli, or coming out, or standing up at school. It was trusting me, trusting that I might be better than my worst instincts. That night, Caleb and I talked after dinner, the way we always seemed to do when something important was ready to surface. "Can I tell you something?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "I was scared that night when you told me. Not of you, of messing it up." He smiled softly. "You didn't." "I could have," I said, "and that scares me even now." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You showed up. That counts." A few days later, Eli called me. His voice sounded lighter than usual. "I got accepted into a leadership fellowship," he said. "They want me to mentor younger kids who've been kicked out." I closed my eyes, letting the weight of that sink in. "That's incredible." "I wanted you to know," he said, "because you're the reason I believe I can help." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house and finally let myself cry. Not from fear or exhaustion, but from gratitude, for second chances, for chosen family, for the kind of love that grows when it's tested. I understood then that the story didn't belong just to us anymore. It belonged to anyone standing at the edge of a truth, wondering whether honesty would cost them everything. It belonged to parents who think love is instinctual until they learn it's also a decision. The truth my son told me about his friend wasn't what I expected. It was bigger. It asked more of me. It changed me. And if there's one thing I hope you take from our story, it's this. When someone you love hands you their truth, you don't have to have the perfect response. You just have to have an open heart. Everything else can be learned. Because the moment you choose love, you don't just save a relationship, you build a future. The last shift didn't arrive with fanfare. No speeches, no dramatic phone calls. Just a quiet understanding that settled into my bones one evening as I stood at the sink, watching the sky darken outside the kitchen window. The house was calm, not the tense calm of waiting for something to go wrong, but the deep, earned calm that comes after storms have passed and repairs have held. Caleb was back at school by then, busy with classes and new friendships. He called often, sometimes just to tell me something small and unimportant, a professor he liked, a joke that reminded him of home. Each call carried the same unspoken message: I'm okay. We're okay. Eli's life was fuller now in ways that would have seemed impossible not long ago. The mentorship program had paired him with two teenagers who reminded him painfully of himself. He told me how careful he was with them, how he chose his words like stepping stones across deep water. "I don't want them to think they're broken," he said one evening. "I want them to know this part of their story doesn't get to decide the ending." I listened, pride swelling in my chest. Not pride in what I'd done, but in what love, once planted, can grow into all by itself. A few weeks later, Eli invited me to an open house at the program center. I walked through the room slowly, reading handwritten notes taped to bulletin boards, thank yous, apologies, promises to keep going. I saw Eli across the room, laughing easily, his posture relaxed, his presence solid. He caught my eye and smiled, and in that smile I saw a future that no longer needed defending. On the drive home, I thought about the woman I'd been before Caleb told me the truth, how certain I'd been of my role, how untested my ideas of unconditional love really were. I thought being a good parent meant providing stability, rules, protection. I hadn't understood that sometimes it means stepping into uncertainty with your child and saying, "I'm here even when I'm afraid." That night, Caleb called. "Mom," he said, "do you remember when you said family is something you build?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I think I finally get it. I'm building my own version now." I smiled into the quiet room. That's how it's supposed to work. As the call ended, I felt a sense of closure, not because the story was finished, but because it had found its shape. The sharp edges had softened. The fear that once lived in my chest had transformed into something steadier. Trust, faith, a willingness to listen first. I know now that the truth my teenage son told me about his friend wasn't a problem to solve. It was a mirror. It showed me who my child was, who another child needed to become, and who I had the chance to be in that moment. We don't always get warnings before the moments that define us. Sometimes they arrive disguised as confessions, whispered through fear, hoping for mercy. When they do, we can close our hands around our expectations, or we can open our arms. I'm grateful every day I chose the second, because love, when it's real, doesn't demand explanations. It just asks for space to exist. And when you give it that space, it has a way of saving everyone involved.